Estrid Sigfastsdotter was a woman of consequence. She lived in the 11th century. Her world was upland in what is now Sweden. She was not a queen or a fabled shield maiden. She was a landowner, a matriarch, and a community builder. Her life shows a power that was quiet, enduring, and written in stone. Estrid was born around the year 10 into a wealthy family, and she inherited land and status. She outlived at least 2 husbands. This was not unusual. Life was hard, and men who went raiding or trading often did not return. But what Estrid did with her long life was remarkable. She did not just maintain her family's wealth. She expanded it. She managed large estates, including Sasta and Snatsta. This meant she was in charge of the farming, the livestock, the buildings, and all the people who lived and worked on the land. She was the chief executive of a large agricultural enterprise. Her power was not just economic, it was social and spiritual. In her later years, Estrid became a public figure. She commissioned runestones. These were not just memorials. They were public declarations of family lineage, faith, and accomplishment. They were a way to stake a claim on history. Several runestones in the Tabi and Vallentuna areas are connected to her. One stone mentions her marriage to Ostin. Another honors her son Gag, who died in the Byzantine Empire, but her most significant public work was a bridge. One runestone, known as U-136, states that she had a bridge built. Building a bridge was a major undertaking. It required resources, labor, and engineering knowledge. It was also an act of Christian piety, as facilitating travel was seen as a good deed. Estrid, the farm manager and family historian, was also a public works director. She was shaping the physical landscape of her community. When she died, sometime around 1080, she was a very old woman for her time. She had seen her world change from one of Norse gods to the Christian faith. She had managed estates, raised children, buried husbands, and built for the future. Her story is not one of Viking raids and legendary battles. It is a story of management, legacy, and the real, tangible power that a woman could hold. Her life was not an anomaly. It was an example of the authority many women held, an authority we are only now beginning to fully understand. Number 16, a woman was buried with the weapons of a high-ranking officer. In the 1870s, an archaeologist named Hjalmar Stolpe excavated a grave. The location was Birka, a major Viking trading town in Sweden. The grave was incredible. It was a chamber grave cut into a terrace overlooking the town. Inside lay a skeleton, seated upright. The person was surrounded by the tools of a professional warrior. There was a longsword, an axe, a seek's knife, 2 lances, and armor-piercing arrows. 2 shields were placed at their side. A full set of gaming pieces lay in their lap. This suggested not just a fighter, but a strategist, a leader who planned battles. Outside the chamber, 2 horses, a mare and a stallion, were buried with the person. For more than 100 years, this grave, known as BJ 581, was considered the definitive example of a high-status Viking warrior burial. Everyone assumed the skeleton belonged to a man. The grave goods, the martial context, the sheer prestige of the burial, it all pointed to a male chieftain. Textbooks and museum displays presented it as such. No one questioned it. The idea of a female warrior of this rank seemed impossible. The first hints of a different story came from osteology, the study of bones. In the 2010s, Anna Källström, an osteologist at Stockholm University, examined the skeleton. She noted the pelvic shape and the slender cheekbones. These traits were more typically female than male. Her findings were met with skepticism. Some argued that the bones might have been mixed up with another grave over the last century. Others suggested the individual was perhaps just a small-framed man. The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive enough to overturn a century of assumption. The conclusive proof came in 2017. A team led by Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson at Uppsala University decided to end the debate. They drilled into a tooth and a piece of the arm bone to extract ancient DNA. The results were unambiguous. The laboratory analysis found 2 X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. The high-ranking warrior in grave BJ 581 was a woman. The discovery sent shockwaves through the field of Viking studies. This was not a woman buried with a single weapon as a token. This was a complete professional military kit, along with the horses and the gaming set that indicated a command position. The gaming pieces were particularly important. They were a direct parallel to a passage in the sagas where planning a military campaign is described as playing a board game. This person was a planner, a leader. The news caused a significant backlash. Some scholars tried to explain it away. Maybe the weapons were just family heirlooms, maybe the burial was purely symbolic, maybe she was not a warrior at all, but the grave was a monument to a male relative. But the counter-arguments were strong. Viking age burials generally reflected the life and status of the person in the grave. There is no other example of someone being buried with a complete set of another person's professional tools. A blacksmith was buried with his hammers, a trader with her scales, and a warrior with their weapons. To argue that this one case was different required special pleading. The most straightforward interpretation is that the woman was buried this way because she was a military leader. The woman in grave BJ 581 lived in the 10th century. She was over 30 years old when she died. Isotope analysis of her teeth suggested she was not local to Birka, meaning she had traveled, a common trait for Viking warriors and traders. She lived and died as a respected commander. Her community honored her with a burial that cemented her status for eternity. Her existence forces a complete re-evaluation of the role of women in Viking military life. It moves the idea of the shield maiden from the realm of myth into the hard reality of archaeological fact. A woman held one of the highest military ranks in one of the most important towns in the Viking world. Number 15, a seeress was so feared and respected. She was buried with a chieftain's wagon. In 971 AD, a powerful woman died in northern Denmark. Her burial was elaborate, a reflection of her immense status. She was interred in a grave at the Firkat Ring Fortress, one of the major military and political centers of King Harald Bluetooth. She was not a queen, she was not a warrior, she was a vulva, a seeress. Her power came from her connection to the supernatural, her ability to see the future and shape destiny. Her grave, known as Grave 4, was discovered during excavations in the 1950s. The woman was laid to rest in the body of a chariot or wagon. This was an exceptionally high-status burial, as wagons were rare and valuable possessions, usually reserved for the very wealthy or noble. She was dressed in fine blue and red clothes, fastened with a box brooch. Her toes were bound with silver thread. Around her lay the tools of her trade. She had a long iron staff with a bronze basket on top. This was her seeress's staff, or volar. It was the symbol of her office. Inside a small leather purse, archaeologists found the seeds of henbane. Henbane is a plant in the nightshade family. When burned or consumed, it can cause hallucinations. This was likely used to induce a trance state, allowing her to commune with spirits or see into the future. The purse also contained small animal bones, possibly for casting lots or other forms of divination. Her grave also contained items that pointed to a wider, more worldly influence. There was a metal box from Central Asia showing connections to long-distance trade routes. There were bronze bowls from what is now Iran. This woman was not an isolated village mystic. She was part of a network that stretched across the known world. She was also given a silver toe ring, a unique find in Viking burials. The location of her burial is significant. She was not buried in a common cemetery. She was buried within the grounds of a royal fortress. This suggests she was directly connected to the king's power structure. A vulva like her would have been a crucial advisor. She would have been consulted before battles on matters of politics and to predict the success of harvests. Her prophecies could make or break a king's plans. This gave her immense influence. The respect and fear she commanded were so great that she received a burial that rivaled that of a noblewoman. The sagas describe the role of the vulva in detail. In the saga of Eric the Red, a seeress named Thorbjorg visits a settlement in Greenland during a famine. She arrives dressed in a blue cloak, a lambskin hood, and carrying her staff. She is treated with extreme reverence. She is given a high seat, and a special meal is prepared for her. The entire community gathers to hear her prophecies. She performs a ritual chant, a cider, to summon the spirits. Her words determine the fate of the community, telling them when the famine will end. The woman in the Firkat grave was a real-life Thorbjorg. Her power was not based on land or military might. It was based on hidden knowledge of the gods, of fate, of the future. In a world full of uncertainty, her perceived ability to provide answers was a source of incredible authority. People believed she could shape reality. She was a spiritual leader, a political advisor, and a figure of great power. Her burial inside a king's fortress in a nobleman's wagon with treasures from afar shows that her community saw her as essential to their survival and success. Number 14, a woman became the most widely traveled person of the Middle Ages. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir was born in Iceland around the year 980. By the time she died in a convent in Iceland around 1050, she had traveled more extensively than perhaps any other person of her era. Her life story, told in both the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, is a journey of exploration, resilience, and personal transformation. She was not a passenger on these voyages. She was a key figure, an owner of ships, and a leader of expeditions. Her story begins with a move from Iceland to Greenland with her father Thorbjorn. This was a perilous journey across the North Atlantic. They were part of a larger migration seeking new land and opportunities. In Greenland, she married Thorstein, the son of the famous Eric the Red. Her social standing was already high, but her real journey was just beginning. After her first husband died, Gudrid inherited his property and his ambitions. She, along with a merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni, decided to mount a major expedition to a new land to the west, a place Leif Erikson had recently discovered and called Vinland. This was North America. They were not just exploring, they were attempting to establish a permanent colony. Around the year 1010, Gudrid and Karlsefni led an expedition of 3 ships and about 160 people. Gudrid was a co-leader of this venture. This was a massive undertaking, a private colonization effort sailing into the unknown. They sailed south from Greenland and established a settlement, likely at Elanseos Meadows in modern-day Newfoundland, Canada. During their time in Vinland, Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Thorfinnsson. Snorri is the first known European born in the Americas. Gudrid was not just a colonist, she was the mother of a new generation in a new world. The settlement lasted for about 3 years. They traded with the native people, whom they called Skraelings, but relations eventually turned hostile. The small Viking colony could not sustain itself so far from home, and they made the decision to return to Greenland. Gudrid's travels were far from over. After returning to Greenland, she and Karlsefni decided to sail back to Norway to sell the goods they had acquired in Vinland, such as timber and furs. They were successful traders from Norway. They did not return directly home. Instead, they decided to make a pilgrimage to Rome. This final leg of her journey is perhaps the most astounding. In the mid-11th century, a woman from Iceland, who had lived in Greenland and given birth in North America, traveled all the way south through Europe to the center of the Christian world. So she walked the same roads as emperors and popes. She had crossed the known world from its westernmost edge to its spiritual heart. After her pilgrimage, Gudrid returned to Iceland. By this time, she was a widow again. She took over the family farm at Glambear. She had seen the world and was now a powerful landowner in her own right. In her old age, as Christianity took firm root in Iceland, she became a nun and lived out her final days in a convent that her son Snorri had built. Gudrid's life shows an incredible degree of independence and agency. She was an explorer who crossed the Atlantic multiple times. She was a colonist who helped found a settlement in a new continent. She was a mother. She was a successful merchant. And she was a pilgrim who traveled to Rome. She made decisions, took risks, and shaped her own destiny. But her story, preserved in the sagas, makes her one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. Number 13, a queen regent ruled with an iron fist and avenged her husband's death. But Olga of Kyiv was not a typical Viking woman, but her story is inseparable from the Viking world. She was the wife of Igor, the ruler of the Kievan Rus, a state founded by Viking traders and warriors known as the Rus. Igor was a descendant of the legendary Rurik. When Igor was killed by a tribe known as the Drevlians in 945, Olga became the regent for her young son, Sviatoslav. The Drevlians assumed that the widowed queen would be weak and easy to manipulate. They were catastrophically wrong. The Drevlians sent 20 of their best men by boat to Kyiv to propose that Olga marry their prince Mao. This would have given them control over the Rus. Olga greeted the ambassadors with seeming kindness, and she told them she was honored by their proposal and that they should be carried in their boat to her court the next day as a sign of respect. The Drevlians, proud and arrogant, agreed. The next day, as they were carried in their boat, they were dropped into a deep trench that had been dug overnight on Olga's orders. She had them buried alive. Olga then sent a message to the Drevlians saying she would agree to the marriage, but first required their most distinguished men to escort her. When a party of the Drevlian elite arrived, Olga ordered her servants to draw them a hot bath. Once the Drevlians were inside the bathhouse, Olga had the doors locked and the building set on fire. No one escaped. She was still not finished. She sent another message to the Drevlians telling them she was coming to their capital, Iskarostan, to hold a funeral feast for her dead husband. She invited them to mourn with her. The Drevlians, still unaware of the fate of their two delegations, gathered for the feast. Olga's soldiers served them mead until they were heavily intoxicated. Then, at Olga's signal, her soldiers drew their swords and killed an estimated 5,000 Drevlians. The final act of her revenge was the siege of Iskarostan in 946. The city held out for a year. According to the primary chronicle, Olga then offered them a deal. She told them she would forgive them if they each gave her 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every house. The Drevlians, desperate and relieved, quickly gathered the birds and sent them to her. Olga then ordered her soldiers to attach a piece of sulfur bound with cloth to each bird's leg. At nightfall, they lit the sulfur and released the birds. The birds flew back to their nests in the eaves and thatches of the wooden houses in Iskarostan. The entire city was set ablaze. As the people fled the burning city, Olga's army captured them. She had many of the leaders executed and gave the rest away as slaves to her followers. Her revenge was complete. She had systematically and ruthlessly eliminated the Drevlian leadership and crushed their power. After this, she ruled the Kievan Rus as a competent and effective administrator. She reformed the system of tribute gathering, the very issue that had led to her husband's death. She established trading posts and administrative centers throughout her lands. She centralized power and laid the governmental foundations for what would become the largest state in Europe. In her later life, Olga traveled to Constantinople and converted to Orthodox Christianity around the year 957. She tried to convert her son Sviatoslav, but he remained a pagan. However, her grandson Vladimir the Great would later make Christianity the state religion. Olga's power was absolute. She acted as a ruler, a general, and a lawmaker. She used cunning, diplomacy, and brutal force to secure her son's inheritance and strengthen her kingdom. She is now a saint in the Orthodox Church, but her early reign shows the raw, unforgiving power that a woman of Viking heritage could command. Number 12, a woman was buried with the scales of a merchant. In a 10th century grave in Hnapstadir in northern Iceland, archaeologists found the skeleton of a woman. She was buried with the typical grave goods for a high-status woman of her time: beads, a brooch, and a knife. But among these items was something unexpected. It was a set of folding balance scales complete with lead weights. These were the tools of a merchant. This discovery challenges the traditional view of the Viking economy, where men were the traders and women managed the farm. The presence of scales in a woman's grave strongly suggests she was involved in commerce. Scales were not symbolic items. They were practical tools for weighing goods, silver, and other forms of currency. A person buried with scales was a person who conducted business transactions in life. This woman was likely a powerful figure in her community. She might have been the mistress of a large farm, but her role extended beyond simple household management. She was trading the surplus from her farm wool, cloth, cheese, or hides with visiting merchants or her neighbors. The Icelandic economy relied heavily on a standardized woolen cloth called vadmal, which functioned as a form of currency. Producing this cloth was women's work, from shearing the sheep to spinning the yarn and weaving the fabric. A woman who managed this production and then traded the final product held significant economic power. She was not just a producer, she was a businesswoman. The scales themselves tell a story of connection. They were a portable, high-precision instrument. They imply a world of calculation and negotiation. This woman would have understood weights and measures. She would have known the value of different goods. She would have bargained with ship captains from Norway, traders from the British Isles, or other Icelandic chieftains. Her authority would have been based on her economic acumen. Other graves across the Viking world support this picture. Her female graves in places like Birka, Sweden, have also been found with scales and weights. These were not isolated incidents. They represent a class of women who were active participants in the commercial life of their time. They were not just passive beneficiaries of their husbands' trading voyages. They were traders in their own right. In the Icelandic sagas, women are often depicted as shrewd managers of wealth. They are seen advising their husbands on financial matters, guarding the family fortune, and sometimes even instigating trading voyages. The story of Odd the Deep-Minded, who led her entire household from Scotland to Iceland, involved the management of immense wealth and the logistics of a major sea voyage. While Odd was an exceptional figure, the woman from Napstadir represents the everyday reality of this female economic power. Her power was tangible. It was in the silver she weighed, the cloth she sold, and the goods she acquired. This economic independence gave her a level of freedom and influence that was significant. She could accumulate her own wealth. She could make her own business decisions. She was a key player in the economic network that connected her remote Icelandic farmstead to the wider world. The simple set of scales in her grave speaks to a life of commercial activity, and the quiet power that came with it. Number 11, a woman's words were so powerful they were preserved for 1,000 years. In Viking society, the most respected artists were the skalds. They were poets, but their role went far beyond entertainment. A skald was a historian, a propagandist, and a kingmaker. Their complex, intricate poetry, full of kennings and heady, was the highest form of art. A good poem could grant a king immortality. A bad one could destroy his reputation forever. For centuries, it was assumed that all skalds were men. The sagas are filled with famous male poets like Egil Skallagrimsson and Gunnlaugr Serpent Tongue, but hidden within the historical record are the names of female skalds, women who mastered this difficult and prestigious art form. One of the most notable was Jorunn Skaldmar, which translates to Jorunn the Skald Maiden. She lived in Norway in the early 10th century. Very little is known about her life, but a significant fragment of her work survives because it was quoted by the famous 13th century historian Snorri Sturluson in his works, including the Heimskringla, a history of the Norwegian kings. The fact that Snorri, writing hundreds of years later, knew of her and considered her work authoritative enough to include in his history is a measure of her importance. The surviving poem by Jorunn is called the Sendibiter, or Biting Message. It describes a conflict between two Norwegian kings, Harald Fairhair and his son Halfdan the Black. The poem is not a simple narrative. It is politically charged and highly sophisticated. In it, Jorunn speaks of the hate-swollen message between the father and son, a conflict that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. Her poetry is vivid and powerful, using complex metaphors to describe the political tension. To be a skald, a woman like Jorunn would have needed a deep education. She would have to master the complex rules of Norse meter and diction. She would need an encyclopedic knowledge of mythology and heroic lore to create the kennings that were the hallmark of skaldic verse. This was not a casual hobby. It was a profession that required years of training and immense intellectual skill. The power of a skald was the power of public opinion. Their poems were performed in the halls of kings and chieftains. They were the media of their day. For a woman to hold this role meant she had a public voice. She was not confined to the domestic sphere. She was participating in the political discourse of her time. Her words had weight. They could influence the way people thought about their leaders and the events of their day. There were other female skalds as well. Hildur Rolfsdottir, another 10th century Norwegian poet, composed a poem demanding that the King of Norway allow her exiled son to return. Her verse was a direct political appeal, a mother using the most powerful medium available to her to influence royal policy. Steinunn Refsdottir, an Icelandic skald from the late 10th century, famously engaged in a poetic duel with a Christian missionary, using her verse to praise the Norse gods and mock the new faith. These women were not just anomalies, they were part of a tradition. Their power was not in the sword or the scepter, but in the spoken word. They were masters of language, and in a society that valued oral history and poetry, this made them incredibly influential. Jorunn Skaldmar's work, preserved for over a millennium, is a lasting record of a woman who wielded power through her intellect and her art. Number 10, a woman could publicly divorce her husband for being a bad dresser. Viking age law, particularly in Iceland, gave women rights that were unusual for the time. One of the most striking of these was the right to initiate a divorce. A woman could leave her husband for a number of reasons, and the law provided a clear process for doing so. This legal standing gave women a powerful tool to escape bad marriages and control their own lives. The Icelandic law code, the Graga's Grey Goose Laws, outlines the grounds and procedures for divorce in detail. A marriage could be dissolved if the husband was unable to support the family, if he mistreated her or her kin, or even if he was impotent. But some of the grounds for divorce were surprisingly personal. The Laxdæla saga tells the story of Thurid Olafsdottir. She was married to a man named Thorvald. The saga describes him as a dandy, a man overly concerned with his appearance. But his real failing in Thurid's eyes was his clothing. He wore a shirt with such a low-cut neckline that it exposed his chest. In the saga, Thurid finds this so shameful and unmanly that she decides she cannot stay married to him. The law was on her side. According to the Gragas, a woman could divorce her husband if he wore clothes that were considered effeminate or inappropriate, just as a man could divorce his wife for the same reason. The law specified low-cut shirts for men and trousers for women as grounds for separation. This was about more than just fashion. It was about upholding social norms and personal dignity. Thurid did not just quietly leave. The law required a public declaration. A woman had to declare her intention to divorce her husband in front of witnesses. The declaration had to be made in 3 specific places: at their bed, at the main door of their house, and at the local assembly or thing. This was a formal legal proceeding. Thurid followed the procedure. She declared herself divorced from Thorvald and went back to her father's home. The divorce was legal and binding. This right to divorce was connected to property. When a woman married, her family provided a dowry. She also had her own personal property, her Heimanfylgja. Upon a legal divorce, she was entitled to take all of her property back. This financial independence was crucial. It meant a woman was not trapped in a marriage for economic reasons. She could leave, retrieve her assets, and have the means to start a new life. The story of Thurid, while seemingly trivial, highlights a profound aspect of a woman's power. She had the legal right to end a marriage based on her own judgment of her husband's character and behavior. She was not his property. She was a legal entity with her own rights and her own sense of honor. The fact that the law took something like a low-cut shirt seriously shows that a partner's public reputation and the shame they might bring upon the family were legitimate concerns. This was not a simple or easy process. It required courage and public action, but the existence of this right in the law codes of Iceland and other parts of the Norse world gave women a level of autonomy that was rare in medieval Europe. As a woman like Thurid could refuse to be associated with a man she did not respect, and she could use the power of the law to enforce her decision. On number 9, a woman led her entire clan across the sea and claimed a vast territory. Odd the Deep-Minded was one of the great matriarchs of the Viking Age. Her story, told in the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, and the Laxdæla Saga, is an epic of leadership, foresight, and the establishment of a powerful dynasty. She was not a queen by title, but she acted with the authority of one. She lived in the 9th century, a period of great upheaval and migration. Her Odd was the daughter of Ketil Flatnose, a powerful chieftain in Norway. Her family fell out with King Harald Fairhair, who was consolidating his power over Norway. To escape his rule, Ketil and his family moved to Scotland. There, Odd married Olaf the White, the Viking king of Dublin. She lived as a queen in Ireland and had a son named Thorstein the Red. Her life took a dramatic turn when both her husband and her son were killed in battle in Britain. Odd was left a widow in a hostile land, responsible for her household and her grandchildren. Many women in her position would have sought the protection of a male relative or remarried quickly. Odd chose a different path. She decided to take control of her own destiny and that of her entire clan. Secretly, she commissioned the construction of a nar, a large, ocean-going Viking ship in the woods. When the ship was ready, she loaded it with her family, her retainers, and all the wealth she could gather. With a crew of 20 free men under her command, she set sail from Scotland. She was the undisputed leader of this expedition. Her destination was Iceland, a new land that offered the promise of freedom and opportunity. But she did not sail there directly. She first stopped in the Orkney and Faroe Islands. At each stop, she asserted her authority by arranging a marriage for one of her granddaughters. These were not just family matters, they were political alliances. She was strategically placing her kin in positions of power, building a network of influence across the North Atlantic. When she finally arrived in Iceland, she sailed along the coast of the Breiðafjörður Bay. She was looking for the perfect place to settle. She eventually claimed a vast swath of land, the entire area of the Dale Lands Delir. According to the sagas, she consulted with her crew, but the final decision was hers. She established her main farm at a place she named Vam. Once settled, Odd demonstrated her power not through force, but through generosity and law. She was a ring giver, a term usually reserved for male chieftains. She distributed land to the members of her crew and to her freed slaves. This was a radical act. In most societies, slaves who were freed were left with nothing. Odd gave her former slaves large farms, allowing them to become independent landowners and founders of their own families. This act of patronage earned her immense loyalty and respect. Odd lived to an old age, governing her lands and her large, extended family. She was known as the Deep-Minded for her wisdom and intelligence. When she knew she was dying, she arranged a great feast for her family and friends. The saga says she walked among her guests, ensuring everyone was happy. The next morning, she was found dead in her bed, having passed away peacefully. She was given a ship burial, an honor typically reserved for the greatest of chieftains. Odd's life story is a powerful example of female leadership. She was a ship's captain, an explorer, a political strategist, and a lawgiver. She took control in a moment of crisis and led her people to a new home, establishing one of the most powerful families in Iceland. Her authority was never questioned. It was earned through her intelligence, courage, and a deep sense of responsibility for her people. Number 8. A woman's power was symbolized by the keys at her belt. In the Viking Age, the mistress of a farmstead held a position of great authority. She was the manager of the household, responsible for everything that happened within the walls of the longhouse. This power was not just implied, it was made visible through a powerful symbol, the keys. The keys to the food stores, the chests of valuables, and the linen closets hung from a woman's belt. She was the keeper of the keys, and this role gave her practical and symbolic control over the family's well-being and wealth. Archaeology provides clear evidence for this role. In numerous female graves from across the Viking world, keys are a common find. They are often found near the woman's waist, indicating they were worn as part of her daily attire. These were not just simple door keys. They were often ornate, made of bronze or iron, and designed to open padlocks on the large wooden chests that held the family's most important possessions. These chests contained stored food, precious textiles, silver, jewelry, and family heirlooms. Access to these resources was controlled by the woman of the house. This control over resources was the foundation of her power. She decided how much food was allocated for daily meals. and how much was saved for the long winter. Well, she managed the production of textiles, the wool and linen that were not only used for clothing, but were also a major form of currency and a key trade good. The wealth of the farm was, in a very real sense, in her hands. The sagas reinforce this image. When a couple married, the legal ritual often involved the groom handing the keys of the household over to his new bride. This was a formal transfer of authority. From that moment on, she was the manager of the household's internal affairs. This was a domain where she ruled. The role of the husfreyja, or lady of the house, was a respected and demanding one. While her husband might be away trading, raiding, or at the local assembly, she was in command of the farm. This could last for months or even years. She had to manage the servants and slaves, oversee the care of livestock, direct the planting and harvesting of crops, and provide for the health and welfare of everyone living on the estate. She was the chief operating officer of a complex enterprise. The keys were a constant, visible reminder of this authority to everyone on the farm. They showed who was in charge of provisions and who had the right to distribute the farm's wealth. In a society where hospitality was a crucial virtue, the woman of the house was the one who welcomed guests and provided them with food and drink. This role as the dispenser of hospitality was another source of social power and prestige. The loss of one's keys was a profound loss of status. In some sagas, a divorce is symbolized by the woman throwing the keys at her husband. It was a public act of relinquishing her role and her authority over the household. The woman buried with her keys was being honored for her role in life. Her community was acknowledging her as a capable manager, a provider, and the guardian of her family's prosperity. The simple iron keys found in her grave represent a world of responsibility and a form of power that was fundamental to the functioning of Viking society. It was a power wielded not on the battlefield, but in the heart of the home. Number 7. Women controlled an industry that was the backbone of the economy. Viking men are famous for their silver hoards and long-distance trade, but the foundation of the Viking economy, especially in places like Iceland and the North Atlantic colonies, was not silver. It was cloth. Specifically, it was a coarse woolen cloth called vadmal wadmal. The production of vadmal was entirely in the hands of women, and this gave them immense economic power. From the shearing of the sheep to the final woven bolt of fabric, every step of the process was women's work. They washed and carded the wool, spun it into yarn using a drop spindle, dyed it with local plants, and then wove it into cloth on a vertical loom. This was a laborious, time-consuming process that required great skill. A single bolt of cloth represented hundreds of hours of female labor. This cloth was not just for making clothes. Vadmal was a legally recognized form of currency. The Icelandic law codes, the gragas, set the value of goods and fines not in silver, but in units of vadmal. A specific length and quality of cloth was equal to a certain amount of silver. You could pay your taxes, buy land, or settle a legal dispute with bolts of woolen fabric. This meant that the output of a woman's loom was, quite literally, money. The mistress of a farmstead was the manager of this textile factory. So she directed the work of her daughters, female relatives, and slaves. She was responsible for the quality control and the quantity of the output. A farm with many skilled women could produce a significant surplus of vadmal, making the family wealthy. Archaeology confirms the importance of this work. Across the Viking world, the most common artifacts found at settlement sites are spindle hurls, the weights for the drop spindle, and loom weights, the clay or stone weights that held the warp threads taut on the loom. These simple, everyday tools are the silent witnesses to a massive female-driven industry. In some female graves, women are buried with their weaving tools, honoring their life's work and their economic contribution. The power this gave women was substantial. Because they controlled the production of a key economic resource, they had a say in the family's financial decisions. The wealth they created was not abstract, it was the tangible cloth stored in their chests. This economic contribution earned them respect and a degree of independence. This cloth was also a major export. Icelandic vadmel was highly prized in Europe. Viking traders carried it to Britain, continental Europe, and beyond. The profits from this trade flowed back into the community, often in the form of silver, jewelry, and other luxury goods. While men may have sailed the ships, the cargo they carried was often the product of their wives' and daughters' labor. This industry also gave women a way to build social networks. They worked together, shared skills, and created a community of producers. The quality of a woman's weaving was a source of personal pride and public reputation. A skilled weaver was a valuable asset to her family and her community. The story of Vadmel is the story of how women's domestic labor was transformed into public economic power. It was not glamorous, it was hard, repetitive work, but it was essential. By controlling this industry, women were not just on the sidelines of the Viking economy, they were at its very center. Number 6, a woman's knowledge of healing could mean the difference between life and death. In a world without modern medicine, knowledge of healing was a vital and powerful skill. Sickness and injury were constant threats. A person who knew how to set a broken bone, stitch a wound, or use herbs to treat an illness held a great deal of influence. In Viking society, this role of healer often fell to women. The sagas are filled with references to women who were skilled in the healing arts. They are often called greater eye healers or Leiknir leeches or doctors. Their knowledge was a practical blend of herbalism, folk medicine, and hands-on surgical skill. This was not magic, it was a respected form of medical practice. In Njal's saga, one of the most famous Icelandic sagas, a woman named Hildigunr is described as tending to the wounds of a man named Housegold. Her skill is taken for granted as a necessary part of life. In other sagas, women are shown cleaning and binding the wounds of men returning from battle. Their role was crucial. A warrior might survive the fight, but it was the skill of the healer that determined whether he would survive the infected wound that followed. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. In some female graves, archaeologists have found small kits that may have contained medical or surgical instruments. At a site in Gotland, Sweden, a grave believed to be that of a female healer contained a set of probes and scrapers. The woman was also buried with a container of animal fat, which may have been used as a base for salves and ointments. This knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter. It was a body of lore built up over generations of observation and practice. Women knew the properties of local plants. They knew that willow bark could ease pain, that yarrow could help stop bleeding, and that certain mosses had antiseptic properties. They understood the basics of anatomy and how to treat common injuries. The power of a healer was the power over life and death. In a small, isolated community, the local healing woman was an indispensable figure. People would come to her with their sick children, their injured husbands, their own ailments. Her ability to provide relief and effect a cure would earn her immense respect and gratitude. This respect translated into social standing and influence. This role also required courage and a strong stomach. Treating the gruesome wounds sustained in Viking Age combat would have been a difficult and bloody business. A healer had to be steady-handed and clear-headed in a crisis. While some men were also known as healers, the association with women was strong. This may be because it was seen as an extension of their role as caregivers within the family, but it was a role that took them beyond the household. They were public figures serving the entire community. In a society that placed a high value on strength and health, the person who could restore them was powerful. The female healer was not a warrior or a ruler, but her contribution to the survival and well-being of her community was just as important. Her power came from her knowledge, her skill, and the deep trust that her people placed in her hands. Number 5, fostering a child was a way for a woman to build powerful alliances. In the Viking Age, sending a child to be raised in another household was a common practice. This was called fostering. It was not a sign of poverty or an inability to care for the child. On the contrary, it was a strategic social tool used by powerful families to create bonds of kinship and obligation. The woman of the house, the foster mother, was at the center of this crucial social institution. When a chieftain or a powerful farmer took in a foster child, that child was treated as one of their own, as they were raised alongside the family's biological children. receiving the same education, care, and affection. The bond between a foster child and their foster parents, particularly the foster mother, was often as strong or even stronger than the bond with their birth parents. This created a lifelong alliance between the two families. The woman who acted as a foster mother played a vital role in this process. She was the one who provided the daily care and upbringing for the child. She was the one who created the emotional ties that would last a lifetime. Through her care, she was weaving a web of social and political alliances for her family. The sagas are full of examples of how important these foster relationships were. A foster son was expected to support his foster family in feuds and political disputes. He would avenge his foster father or foster brothers as if they were his own blood. The families were now linked. An insult to one was an insult to the other. This gave the foster mother a unique form of influence. By raising the children of other powerful men, she was helping to shape the next generation of leaders. She was instilling her family's values and creating a deep sense of loyalty in these future chieftains. Her foster sons would remember her care and feel a sense of debt and affection towards her and her family for the rest of their lives. In Eagle's saga, the main character, Eagle Skallagrimson, is fostered by a powerful man named Thorolf. The bond he forms with the family is central to the saga's plot. In other stories, foster relationships determine the course of major feuds and political struggles. The decision to foster a child was a serious one, made by both the husband and the wife. But the success of the arrangement depended heavily on the foster mother. Her ability to integrate the child into her household and to create a loving, stable environment was key. This was a form of power that was exercised within the domestic sphere, but had huge public consequences. A woman with many successful foster children was a woman with a wide network of allies. Her family was more secure because of the bonds she had helped to create. She was a diplomat and a kingmaker, using the tools of the household scare, education, and affection to build the political and social capital of her family. This practice also shows that childhood and kinship were understood in complex ways. The biological family was important, but so were the families you chose to ally with. The foster mother was the person who turned a strategic decision into a real human connection. She was the architect of her family's social network, a role that gave her a quiet but profound power within her community. Number 4, women commissioned public monuments to shape their family's legacy. Runestones are the most dramatic and enduring documents of the Viking Age. These massive stones, carved with intricate patterns and runic inscriptions, were erected as public monuments. They were placed along roads, at bridges, and at assembly places. They told stories of travel, of death, of inheritance, and of faith. For a long time, it was assumed that men were the ones who commissioned these stones, but a closer look at the inscriptions reveals that women were a driving force behind the creation of these permanent records. A significant number of runestones, perhaps as many as 1 in 8, were either raised by women or in memory of women, or both. This shows that women had the wealth, the status, and the desire to participate in this very public form of commemoration. Commissioning a runestone was not a small undertaking. It required hiring a skilled runemaster, selecting a suitable boulder, moving it into place, and then having it carved. It was an expensive and visible act. Gunhild, a woman who lived in 11th century Sweden, is a prime example. A runestone from the area of Upland states, Gunhild had this bridge made and this stone raised in memory of her son Sven, God help his soul. Like Estrid Sigfastsdotter, Gunhild was a public works patron. She built a bridge, a vital piece of community infrastructure, and then raised a stone to ensure everyone knew who did it and why. She was shaping the physical landscape and the historical narrative at the same time. The inscriptions reveal the many roles women held. Some stones were raised by a mother in memory of a son who died abroad. Gudlog had this stone raised in memory of her son Otrigger, who was killed in Gardariki, the Kevin Roos. This mother was ensuring her son's story was not forgotten, and in doing so, she was also stating her own position as the matriarch of the family. Other stones show women as inheritors of property. An inscription might read, Ingrid inherited from her son. She raised this stone in his memory. This was a public legal declaration. By raising the stone, Ingrid was reinforcing her claim to the land she had inherited. The runestone was a permanent deed carved in granite. Women also commissioned stones for their husbands. Tola had this stone raised in memory of her husband Geir, a very good Drengr, a man of honor, who was the western commander of the Lidanga fleet. Tola was not just mourning her husband, she was celebrating his public service and her connection to it. The act of commissioning a runestone gave a woman a public voice. Her name was carved in stone for all to see. She was the one telling the story, deciding what was important to remember. This was a powerful way to shape the family's reputation and legacy. In a society that valued fame and memory, controlling the narrative was a significant form of power. These women were not just passive figures in the background, they were active agents in the creation of their own history. They had the economic resources to fund these projects and the social standing to have their actions recorded in the most permanent way available. The runestones commissioned by women like Gunhild and Tola show us that they were not silent. They were landowners, public benefactors, and the keepers of their family's memory. Number 3, a woman's right to own and inherit land was protected by law. In many medieval societies, a woman's right to own property was severely restricted. Land, the primary source of wealth and power, was typically passed down from father to son. But in the Viking world, the laws and customs were different. Women could, and did, own, inherit, and control land. This economic independence was one of the most fundamental sources of their power. The law codes from across the Norse world, from the Norwegian Gulating law to the Icelandic Ragas, all contain provisions for female property ownership. While sons were often favored in inheritance, daughters were not excluded. A daughter was entitled to inherit from her parents, especially if she had no brothers. A woman could also receive land as part of her dowry, which remained her personal property throughout her marriage. The story of Jorunn Hakaardóttir, mentioned in the Norwegian Gulating law from around 900 AD, provides a concrete example. The law discusses a specific inheritance case involving her. Jorunn, as a paternal aunt, was given legal precedence to inherit property over the deceased's grandsons. This case was considered so important that it was used as a legal precedent in the law code itself. It demonstrates that a woman's claim to land, based on her kinship, was legally recognized and defended. A woman who owned land was a powerful figure. She was a bondi, a landowner, just like a man. She could manage her farm, sell its produce, and make decisions about its use. If she was a widow, she often took over the management of the entire family estate, at least until her sons came of age. In many cases, a strong-willed widow would continue to run the farm for the rest of her life. This right to own land gave women a crucial safety net. If a woman divorced her husband, she was entitled to her dowry and any personal property she had brought into the marriage. This meant she was not left destitute. She had the means to support herself and her children. The sagas provide many examples of powerful landowning women. Odd the Deep-Minded claimed a vast territory in Iceland and distributed it to her followers. Un from the Landnámabók was another early settler who claimed her own land. These women were not just wives or mothers, they were founders of dynasties, their power rooted in the land they controlled. The runestones also serve as public records of female land ownership. An inscription might name a woman as the one who inherited an estate. This was not just a memorial, it was a public declaration of her legal rights, carved in stone for the whole community to see. This right was not absolute equality. In most cases, a son would inherit twice as much as a daughter. But the fact that daughters inherited it all was significant. It meant that the wealth and power were not exclusively concentrated in male hands. And women were active participants in the economic life of their society, not just as managers of households, but as owners of the very land that sustained it. The case of Jorunn Hakaardóttir shows that this was not just a custom, but a right that could be upheld by the law. Number 2, a queen of Denmark was a master builder and a political force. Thyra, who lived in the 10th century, was the wife of King Gorm the Old of Denmark and the mother of the famous King Harald Bluetooth. In historical accounts, she is often overshadowed by her husband and son, but the evidence suggests that she was a major political power in her own right, a ruler who literally shaped the landscape of her kingdom. She is remembered in some sources with the epithet Danbod, which can be translated as ornament of the Danes, or more tellingly, salvation of the Danes. Her most famous achievement is her connection to the Danevirke. The Danevirke was a massive system of defensive earthworks, walls, and ditches that stretched across the neck of the Jutland Peninsula. It was designed to protect Denmark from invasion from the south, particularly from the powerful German Empire. While parts of the Danevirke were built earlier, it was significantly expanded and fortified in the 10th century. Snorri Sturluson, in his Heimskringla, explicitly credits Thyra with being the driving force behind this construction. He states that Thyra had the wall built. Whether she personally directed the construction or was the political will behind it, her association with this monumental project is significant. Building the Danevirke was a national undertaking. It required immense resources, a massive labor force, and sophisticated logistical planning. It was the most ambitious military construction project in Scandinavia at the time. To be credited with its creation means that Thyra was perceived as a powerful and effective ruler, one concerned with the defense and sovereignty of her kingdom. She was not just a queen consort, she was a national defender. Further evidence of her status comes from runestones. On one of the famous gelling stones, the larger one erected by her son Harold, she is mentioned prominently. The inscription reads, King Haraldr ordered this monument made in memory of Gormr, his father, and in memory of Thurv Thyra, his mother, that Haraldr who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. By naming both his father and his mother on this birth certificate of Denmark, Harold was acknowledging Thyra's crucial role in the founding of the kingdom. She was not an afterthought, she was a co-founder of the dynasty. Another older runestone at Jelling, commissioned by her husband Gorm, is dedicated solely to her. It reads, King Gormr made this monument in memory of Thurv, his wife Denmark's salvation. This is an extraordinary tribute. A king publicly declaring his wife to be the salvation of the entire country. It suggests she played a key role in unifying the kingdom or defending it from a major threat. Thyra's story shows that a queen could wield direct political and military power. She was a builder, a strategist, and a figure of national importance. Her legacy was not just in the son she raised, but in the physical defenses she built and the political stability she helped create. The title Salvation of the Danes was not given lightly. It was a reflection of a woman who was a true partner in power, a queen who governed and defended her people with strength and foresight. Number 1, the woman left in charge of the farm was the foundation of the entire society. The quintessential image of the Viking is the man on the longship, sailing off to raid, trade, or explore. But this image only tells half the story. For every man who left, there was a woman who stayed behind. And the woman who stayed behind was not just waiting. She was in charge. The farm manager, the husfreyja, was the anchor of Viking society. Her power was not occasional or exceptional. It was constant, essential, and absolute within her domain. When a landowner like Thorolfr of a later saga left Iceland to trade in Norway for a season, or a chieftain like Flosi from Njal's saga was away at the Althing for 2 weeks, their wives were not just caretakers. They became the sole authority over the entire farmstead. This was a complex, demanding job. A large farm could be a community of dozens of people-children, elderly relatives, free farmhands, and slaves. The husfreyja was responsible for all of them. Her authority was legally recognized. She had the right to make all necessary decisions in her husband's absence. She directed the work, which was a year-round cycle of tasks. In the spring, she oversaw the planting of crops and the birthing of livestock. In the summer, she managed the dairy, the making of cheese and butter, and the gathering of fodder. In the autumn, she directed the harvest, the slaughtering of animals, and the preservation of food for the winter. Through the long, dark winter, she managed the stored resources, rationing food to ensure the entire household would survive until spring. This was a position of immense logistical and economic responsibility. She had to be a veterinarian, an agronomist, a doctor, and a human resources manager. She had to be able to command, respect, and enforce her decisions. If a dispute broke out among the farmhands, she was the judge. If a predator attacked the sheep, she organized the defense. This power is often depicted in the Icelandic sagas. In the saga of Grettir the Strong, a woman named Asdis runs the farm at Bjarg while her husband is away. She is shown as a competent and respected leader. When a problem arises with her difficult son Grettir, she handles it with firm authority. Her husband, upon his return, supports the decisions she made in his absence. This was the expectation. The woman's authority at home was not to be questioned. This role was the engine that powered the Viking Age. The long-distance voyages of the men were only possible because there was a stable and productive society back home to support them. The ships were provisioned with the food the women had grown and preserved. The trade goods, like wool and cloth, were the products of their labor. The entire system depended on their competence and authority. This power was not temporary. A woman was trained for this role from childhood, and for many it became a permanent position. Given the high mortality rate for men at sea or in battle, many women became widows at a young age. As a widow, a woman often took full control of the family farm, running it for the rest of her life. She became the head of the household in her own right. The woman running the farm was not a warrior or a queen. Her story was not written on runestones, but her power was the most fundamental of all. It was the power to sustain life, to manage resources, and to maintain the social order. Without her, there would have been no Viking Age. She was the strong, steady center around which that entire turbulent world revolved.